Hey, welcome. My name is Amy Sullivan, and I'm the current immediate past president of AAAR. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 42nd in our monthly AS&T lecture series. This is a new initiative for AAAR being supported by the Freelander Memorial Fund. So each month, the editors of AS&T select a high-impact paper to be presented by its authors. We hope with these lectures, we're able to highlight the amazing research happening in our community, tie our journal to other activities, and also give us all the opportunity to gather together outside the annual conference. These lectures are being recorded and will be later posted to AAAR's YouTube channel, which you can access from the AAAR website under the Events tab. In addition, each of these lectures is being hosted by one of AAAR's student chapters. I want to thank all of you for joining us and everyone who's helped to make these lectures happen. And with that, I'll turn it over to our student chapter host from Clarkson University. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting lecture in the AS&T lecture series. I'm Nagarajan Radhakrishnan, the current president of the AAAR student chapter here at Clarkson University. And today I'm delighted to introduce the speakers of the day, Dr. Arthur Chan and Dr. Alex Lee. Dr. Arthur Chan holds a PhD in chemical engineering from Caltech and is now a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry at the University of Toronto. His research examines the chemical composition of atmospheric pollutants to understand their sources, transformations, and impacts. Dr. Alex Lee is a research scientist in atmospheric processes, emissions, and composition section at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and an adjunct professor in Department of Chemical Engineering at University of Toronto. He earned his PhD in chemical engineering from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research examines atmospheric black and brown carbon, particle-bound ROS, micro and nanoplastics with health implications. Today, Dr. Chan and Dr. Lee will present on characterization of airborne nanoplastic particles using aerosol mass spectrometry. The lecture will run for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer session in the end. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them in the end. And now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Chan and Dr. Lee for the talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about our work. I just want to highlight that Michael Tawadros and Lin Kong are the two students who have done all the work that we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So I just want to acknowledge funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada and also from the CRC and NSERC programs. I also want to thank Aerosol Science and Technology for publishing our paper, which we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So I expect everyone to know about micro and nanoplastic. It's all over the news. One of the reasons why it is a problem is that we use a lot of plastic. It's a great material. It's very stable. But then the problem is that they last so long in the environment, they break down into micro and nanoplastics. If we look at the plastic use, you look at a budget of the plastic use, about 10% of it gets recycled. And even when it's recycled, it's not the original quality. A big part of it gets discarded into the environment and also incinerated as well. So in this particular paper from 2017, they estimate about 80% is just discarded into the environment. And when they're in the environment, they can break down, undergo degradation, different forms of degradation, either mechanical or UV or initiated or biodegradation. And they break down into smaller and smaller pieces. And when they get into micro and nano size, they become a huge problem. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
I changed it. Can you see it?
On mine, it's still on the previous slide.
It's still the same?
It's still the same, yes.
How about this? Is it okay?
It's dark now.
Okay. Let me stop sharing and redo it again.
Sure.
Is it? No.
Not really.
Let me try one more time. Stop and start sharing.
It's still in that mode. Do you want me to share?
Yeah, sure, if you can.
Okay.
I just wonder if other people can see it.
You can't see it.
Okay.
No.
Let me stop sharing.
Do you want me to try?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to go off of the Google Slides that we have then. How does that look?
Yep, I can see that slide.
Okay. So continuing on the topic of micro and nanoplastics, when they break down into small enough sizes, then they can enter the air. And that's when it becomes an aerosol problem, right? So aerosol is any particle that is suspended in air. And so, when they're plastic, then they enter sort of our field of study. And so when plastic gets into air, there are many different sources. Some of them can accumulate in the ocean and come out from wave breaking, for example, sea spray. Some of them can be directly emitted from abrasion. And so on the left here is an example of the different sources, different budgets from different sources. And on the right here shows a modeling study that looks at tire and brake wear particles, which is one type of micro and nanoplastic. And they show that when the particles are small enough, for example, if it's in the PM 2.5 size range, then it can be transported from the sources to more remote regions. And so that's one reason why we care about micro and nanoplastics in the atmosphere, is that they can transport much more efficiently. There are also evidence of primary nanoplastic processes. So for example, the paper on the left here is showing that pipe repairs that use hot plastics they inject hot steam to fix leaking pipes. And because the plastic is heated, they can generate these, the plastic can recondense and generate these nanoplastic particles. And the center here shows a study that is doing some source apportionment. So when they look at the back trajectory analysis, it looked like that the polystyrene plastic was coming from an incineration plant. And on the right here shows a study that is looking at particles in Shanghai. And they showed that up to 5 to 10% of PM 2.5 is associated with nanoplastics, micro and nanoplastics. And in that study, they attributed them to factory or traffic emission sources. And one of the common themes of all of these sources is that heat is involved. So when you heat things up, they can vaporize and recondense. And that is potentially one pathway of generating plastics in the atmosphere. And so when we first looked at this question, we started thinking about, is there a really efficient way of heating plastics and then getting them into the atmosphere? And so one such process would be waste incineration. Waste incineration is not very common in North America or in Europe, but it is very common in the global south, in Asia and Africa, for example. And so this particular study showed that about 50% of the plastic that is discarded to the environment is actually through burning, through open burning. In the North American context, maybe plastic incineration is not, there's no intentional plastic incineration, but there could be wildfires that encroach upon the wildland-urban interface. And so when the fires burn building materials, that can introduce plastics into the atmosphere. And so I'm just going to have one slide on the current methods of analyzing nanoplastics. Currently, the gold standard analytical method for plastic is the pyrolysis GCMS. And so a schematic is shown here. And the idea is that you would heat the material up to 600 degrees or higher, hot enough to break chemical bonds. Then when you break them down, you can break the polymer down into these pyrolysates, and you can analyze them using GCMS. The advantage of this method is that it's a very standard technique now for polymer analysis. And you can really, if you do something clever with the heating steps, you can separate the polymeric materials from semi-volatile compounds, so you can specifically target the plastic material. But the limitation of this is that this is an offline analysis. So you have to collect, for atmospheric analysis, we would have to collect the particles onto a filter and subject it to the pyrolysis GCMS analysis. So in this particular talk, we're going to go through a few different topics. The first topic is how do we take this one step further and use online mass spectrometry to characterize the nanoplastic composition. We're going to talk about how we use these techniques to understand physical chemical properties of nanoplastic particles, with a particular focus on burned plastic particles. And then lastly, we'll talk about a method for single particle analysis of airborne nanoplastics. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex.
Thanks, Upper. So as Upper mentions, like the AMS has been used like for the source abortion study to understand how the nanoplastic may be emitted to the air. And this is the study from Texas A&M University that's showing the potential of using this instrument to understand how the nanoplastic emit from the incinerator. And the graph showing on the right-hand side is like when the air mass passing through the incinerator is showing up the higher PS particles level in the atmosphere. And like at the end, they try to inject the PS particles in the atmosphere to see the response. It's a very first study to demonstrate that the techniques can be used for atmospheric nanoplastic detections. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background in case you're not very familiar with the AMS measurements. So the left-hand side is showing the simple schematic diagrams of the instrument. So the whole idea is the AMS has the aerodynamic lens that can focus the particles into a narrow beam, and it will hit on the vaporizer. That's showing on the right-hand side. You can see the vaporizer actually heated up at 600 degrees Celsius, and we have the filament to emit electrons to undergo the electron impact ionization process, so then and sends the ions to the time-of-flight mass spectrometer for the detection. So what I want to highlight here is that like the particles has to be hit on the tungsten vaporizer surface to facilitate the vaporizations process, and that would be the critical part to understand how we can detect nanoplastic particles successfully using this instrument. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned in the introductions, the pyrolysis GCMS is the golden standard for analyze the nanoplastic and also polymer. So what I want to highlight here is the AMS actually hit the materials at the same temperature at the tungsten vaporizer surface, and therefore that is it can imagine like that is like could be very similar vaporizations or even ion fermentation mechanism between the two instruments. And as the pyrolysis GCMS is the golden standard, and it will be very interesting to compare the two instruments to see how we can use the AMS or evaluate the performance of the AMS for nanoplastic detection in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Okay, so for this for the selected AS&T paper, we actually perform a case study using PET nanoplastics from heating. So we use PET as testing materials simply because it's widely used in many different commercial products, like the plastic bottles and also the textile materials that we use, like make clothing. So the methods that we generate the PET nanoplastic is to put those cut this plastic species into the small simulatic mold and put it in the tube furnace and heat it up at around 300 degrees Celsius. We use zero air to carry the particles generated from the heating process and send the particles to the online AMS for real-time characterizations. At the same time, we also collect materials on the filter sample for pyrolysis GC analysis, because as I said, it would be very interesting to compare the two techniques to see how consistent they are or how different they are in terms of the nanoplastic detections. And what I want to emphasize here is we use this technique because we know that that is relevant to the environmental nanoplastic emission process, but also due to the fact that it's very hard to get the pure nanoplastic standard for our analysis. So we're starting from the idea we generate the particles using the tube furnace approach. Next, please. So another method that we use is try to understand how the particles may be emitted from the 3D printing. The 3D printer basically have the heated nozzle, and we try to understand how the particles may emit during from this heating process. And for this work, we try different types of PET materials, PETE and PETG. And PET basically is more like semi-crystalline structure, and the PETG basically have the dichrome structure injected in structures, and it's more like amorphous structure overall. Next slide, please. Okay, so from this heating process, obviously we are not generating just nanoplastic, we actually generate mixture. And this is the slide showing the chromatograph of the Pyrolysis GC results. And the top one is showing the two furnace results. What I can show you here is like you showed many different peaks, like organic peaks showing up for the chromatograph for the raw materials that we for the burnt pieces that remained in the tube furnace. You can see the blue chase is having a lot of peaks, and also you can see the gray one in the middle, which is actually from the nanoplastics collected on the filter. And it makes sense because like we know that the high temperature basically like can promote the thermal decompositions or even oxidation process during the particle generation process. And here, like we can confirm that we actually have the polymeric contents in the sample, because like in the green area is more like the peaks associated with the terephthalate acid monomer structure, and also like from the gray area is showing the dimers and trimer related compound structures. But what's interesting to us is the blue area is showing some of the thermal degradation products, which is related to the benzoic acid. So overall, we know that heating process is generating quite a lot of organic materials that form the mixture of nanoplastic and organics. Next slide, please. Okay, so and the first thing we try to understand the performance of the AMS measurement is we try to compare the overall mass spectrum of the Pyrolysis GC-MS and also the AMS materials. For the very bottom one, mass spectrum here is showing the mass spectrum from the pyrolysis analysis. And you can see overall, in general, the AMS mass spectrum from different materials, no matter it's from PETG or PETE or from tube furnace or 3D printer, they are very similar to each other. It's showing us, it's very encouraging that like the AMS actually detecting the materials very consistent to what we can observe from the Pyrolysis GC. And that's actually formed the strong foundations for us to further compare these two methods in our future study. And just a little bit more details here, you can see the monomer piece is showing up for like at mass recharge 149, 166, and 193. And we also observe some oxidation products showing at 104, 105, and 121. And for the AMS, the major difference is we see way more signals at the mass recharge 28 and 44, which is related to the highly oxygenated materials from the AMS measurements. Next slide, please. Qualitatively, we know like the mass spectrum between all these measurements are very consistent to each other, but we try to do a little bit more quantitative comparison. And here is showing about like we try to integrate the signal from dimers, monomers, and the thermal oxidation product. And here is showing some of the results for PETG from tube furnace and 3D printing, and also the tube furnace PETE materials. So what it's showing here is that we definitely see the dimer and monomer signal. And what's interesting to us is it seems that like it doesn't really matter if we analyze PETG or PETE nanoplastics, they all like looks like very similar in terms of the dimer and mono contributions. But next, please. And when we compare to Pyrolysis GC, overall, I would say it's still similar, but it actually shows some distinguishable difference. For example, when you try to look at the raw materials, the raw PETE and PETG, they actually show more dimers and trimer structures and less oxidation products. But for those filter samples collect from the tube furnace, we definitely see more oxidation products peaks and also less contribution from dimer and monomer. But what's interesting to us is when you see compare the middle data, like the tube furnace PET analyzed by AMS is actually quite comparable to the Pyrolysis GC-MS results for tube furnace PETE. And that's again give us the confidence that we have actually like the AMS can measure the nanoplastic mixture materials quite well compared to the golden standard. Next slide, please. And the next step, we actually try to understand how we can better use the instrument to do the quantification of the nanoplastics. So for this purpose, we always, from the AMS community, always try to determine the relative ionization efficiencies of different materials. And the idea is basically we first need to calibrate the instrument using nitrate, and it's showing by blue data points here. It's highly linear and it's showing the very nice response. And the green data point is showing for the PET nanoplastic particle. As you see, it's like have a very strong linear correlations, and it's telling us that the instrument actually can quantify the nanoplastic with the high linearity. Which is something very good for quantifications. And we try to take the ratio of the two slope, we get the RIE, and for the particles that we generate, the RIE is about 0.75. And what I want to emphasize here is actually quite common when you try to look at the specific compounds or specific types of particles. The RIE is usually can be quite different to the RIE of organic aerosols that we generally use for ambient aerosol measurements, which is 1.4. We are not exactly know the reason for the differences here, but what I want to highlight here is, next animation, please. The PET particles that we generate can be more like solid-like materials that can create bouncing on the tungsten vaporizer that may be actually lower the RIE number that we have. But for nitrate, we know is even we dry it, it's more like liquid-like. We don't have much bouncing issue on the tungsten vaporizer. So we actually don't know much about the bouncing of the solid nanoplastics materials on the vaporizer. And that's something we want to investigate because that will be eventually affecting the collection efficiencies of particles in the instrument. Next slide, please. And the last observation that I would like to cover here is we actually observe a very broad size distributions of the monodispersed PET particles that we generate. We use the DMA to size select the particles, and here is showing the results for here 300 nanometer particles generated from PET using the tube furnace. So what I want to highlight here is when you look at the green trace, which is the total organics, it shows the p-top sizing of the particles match quite well with the theoretical values when you consider the density of the PET particles. So, but you can see the tails of this size distribution actually extend to up to almost 2 micron. You actually need a very highly density particles to generate these broad distributions. So there's actually two possibilities. The first one is possibly from the tube furnace we generate many particles and they have heterogeneous mixing, which means some particles they may be more oxidized materials, just like the green trace showing the master charge 44, but the rest of the fragments 149, 166, they are the marker for the monomer. That's actually showing up in the later time. But we actually suspect this is more due to the delay of vaporization process of nanoplastic. That is something I will investigate and tell more about in the third part of these presentations. But when we try to look at the delay of vaporization process, next animation, please. What we're really trying to do is when we try to heat up at 600 degrees Celsius, it seems to have a problem, and we try to increase the vaporizer temperature up to 860 degrees. What is really surprising us is we basically we don't see much changes for the size distributions. It seems that within these 600 and to almost 900 degrees Celsius, we cannot really figure out if we have the delay of vaporization process happening. But anyway, this is something that it's actually urged us to further look at it using the single particle approach later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's just a short summary. So as I said, it's very nice to see the AMS measurements consistent with the Parasis GC-MS results in terms of the mass spectral characteristics, so that we can actually always try to use it to compare the two instruments and to see what additional insights that we may have from different types of materials that we generate in the laboratory. We determine the RIE, but we're actually not quite sure about the bouncing issue. And that is related to the topics that after we talk a little bit more in the second part of this talk, is about the phase state and the viscosity of the nanoplastics that we generate. And also, at the end, as I said, we have the broad size distribution, even though we generate monodisperse particles that could be due to the delay of vaporizations. That is something we need to further understand using the more advanced approach that I would like to talk about, which is the single particle data analysis. And I will pass the time to Alfred to the second part of this talk.
Okay, so as Alex mentioned, this was the study that we had done, was published in 2024. Since then, we have asked more questions and we have learned more. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So I'm just going to show you a different slide of showing the same thing that Alex had talked about, but with a different material. This is polyethylene. Polyethylene is a extensive hydrocarbon monomer, extensive hydrocarbon polymer where the monomeric composition is very simple. It's just methyl groups essentially. It's an easier material to look at because the composition is very uniform. And when we analyze them with the pyrolysis GCMS, we could do this in 2 steps. So with these burn plastics, we can first when we analyze them, we can heat them up to 250 degrees first and then do the GCMS analysis. And then that particular mode in the top here, you are only looking at the semi-volatile materials because you're not breaking any chemical bonds just yet. And so you can see that with the LDPE pellets, you could see that there is essentially no signal. So that's light orange. There's essentially no semi-volatile material in the plastic. But when we looked at the burn plastic, there is a huge signal associated with the semi-volatile material, suggesting that when we burn the plastic, when we heat them up, it alters the volatility of the material. And the bottom here, we have the pyrolysis mode. And so this is when we heat it up to 600 degrees to look at the polymers. If you look at the light orange yellow there, you can see very nicely structured, very evenly spaced, very uniform peaks. And they're all really sharp and they're all associated with different sizes of hydrocarbons. And so this is what the original plastic looks like. But when you heat it up and generate particles from it, you can see that in the darker orange, darker brown there, you can see that you see a giant hump, so which means that the mixture is much more complex. And the peaks are still there. So you still have some polymeric signatures, but they're much broader. And so this suggests that the burning process actually modifies the polymeric composition. And so what does that mean in terms of environmental properties? So one of the things we looked at is how persistent these particles would be. And so to investigate this, so we collected particles from our smoldering combustion and then just collect them into solution. Or we use standard polystyrene particles, the PSL that everybody uses for standard. So these are more plastic particles that we think about. And so we took these particles and aerosolized them and then exposed them to an oxidation flow reactor where we expose them to high levels of hydroxyl radical to simulate atmospheric aging. And we look at the composition using the aerosol mass spectrometer. So I'm showing here the AMS spectra from the different experiments. I'll start off with the bottom one right here. So the bottom purple one right here is looking at the PSL particles, the really solid plastic particles. And you can see that after about 3 days equivalent of aging, the composition looks fairly the same. There's a little bit of a decrease in terms of all the different peaks. And you can see that 44 went up a little bit. So 44 is the marker for oxidation products. So there's some oxidation, but it's not very extensive. And this is actually consistent with a study done at Texas A&M group where they looked at polystyrene latex spheres, the PSL, same particles, and look at the oxidation lifetime. And they show about a 10-day lifetime, 10 days half-life. And so this is consistent with what we saw with the very little oxidation associated with about 3 days. If we look at the burn plastic, the story is very different. So the lighter color is the original burnt material, burnt particles. Whereas after the darker colors are showing what happens after 3 days equivalent of aging. You can see that many of the polymeric peaks are gone. So they have all reacted away. And you can see very prominent production of the 44 peak, which is the oxidation product. So suggesting that these particles are oxidizing very rapidly, certainly within the time scale of a few days. If we look at the 44, if we think that 44 is a marker for oxidation product, we can look at the rate of formation of this 44 as a proxy for the oxidation rate. And so on the bottom here, you can see that this is the solid PSL particles, polystyrene particles. You can see that the formation rate is quite slow. And these burn particles are the ones here. They're all forming oxidation products relatively quickly. In fact, if you compare it to other types of organic aerosol, like biomass burning organic aerosol or vehicle exhaust, they're comparable. The rates are comparable. Even within the different types of plastic, there are some differences in the oxidation rate. And so polystyrene is the fastest, followed by LDPE and polypropylene, PP, and PET. And then polystyrene latex spheres are the slowest. And so we were wondering why that is the case. And so we actually worked with Alex Lassen's group to look more closely at this. They had actually done very similar experiments, and they heated up plastics and at different temperatures. And what they did was analyze the effluent from the heating using the TPT DART-MS. And in this particular technique, they can look at the molecular formulas of the compounds that are emitted. And based on the molecular formulas, they can calculate things like O to C ratios. And from the O to C ratios and the volatility, they can calculate viscosity. And so what they have calculated based on the different materials are different viscosities. And so you can pick a particular relative humidity. So let's say if it's 35%, they can use something called molecular corridors to calculate the viscosity of the material. And we can see that polystyrene has the lowest viscosity, followed by polyethylene, PE, then PP, then PET. And so this order of increasing viscosity is exactly opposite to our rate of oxidation, which is very consistent with the idea that the least viscous material allows faster diffusion and for oxidants and for the material to diffuse around and oxidize much more quickly. And for polystyrene latex spheres, these are solid particles. The diffusion is very slow, and that is very resistant to oxidation. And so a little bit more about this. The material after burning, the plastic after burning, is not completely liquid-like. We still see partially polymeric signatures in the pyrolysis GCMS. We can also do something that is done in the plastic world and do a hydrogen peroxide digestion. And this particular technique is used to remove all the labile organic materials and only focus on analyzing the plastic materials. And so when we did the hydrogen peroxide digestion, we didn't lose all the signal. We lose about half to about 20% of the signal, suggesting that there's still quite a bit of material that is, what we call plastic-like. And as I mentioned earlier, based on the molecular corridors calculation, it exists in a semi-solid phase state. But based on what we have seen is that it rapidly becomes oxidized within the timescale of days. So this has important implication in terms of what it means for the environment. As I mentioned before, this is a very important branch of the plastic cycle. Up to half of this plastic enters the environment via incineration or burning. And this particular pathway emits plastic that are very different from what we associate with nanoplastic. It's not really completely plastic, also not completely organic. It's somewhere in between. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Alex to talk about the last study.
Thanks, Arthur. So the last part is about using the single particle techniques, because as Arthur mentioned, for the first study, we learn a lot and ask more questions. And we think about there's a few questions that in our mind that we need to tackle it. Like, for example, the bouncing issues and also the delayed vaporization process that may happen for the nanoplastic materials. So we come up with the ideas like we probably can learn something new from the single particle techniques. So this is not completely new, but is the techniques that we can identify single particle mass spectrum using so-called the event trigger single particle mode, ETSP. Basically, like as long as the particles vaporized by the AMS and generate certain threshold number of ions, the system trigger the detections, and then you will get the mass spectrum of individual particles and also the sizing information as well. And it's very different to the conventional approach we call it bulk mode, because the bulk mode basically detects the averaging of the mass, the total of multiple particles, and give you the overall distributions. And we won't be able to get the details of the mixing state and also the sizing information of individual particles using the bulk mode. So next slide, please. My groups have been using this approach not for nanoplastic, but for ambient measurements. For example, the left-hand side, the graph is showing the particle diversity that we calculate based on the single particle compositions. And you can see we actually can use this technique to understand how, for example, SOA formations or even atmospheric dilutions process that may affect the particle diversity as a function of aging. And the right-hand side is the study in Brisbane that showing the results from the mobile platform, like the blue color is showing the particles you actually have like more homogeneous particles, and in the close to the city center, we actually have like more heterogeneous particles because we have more primary emissions. So it's like the techniques, the single particle techniques can help us to understand how the atmospheric processing affects the mixing and also the compositions of the aerosol. Next slide, please. For doing this, we actually trying to first compare about the mass spectrum between the bulk mode and also the ETSP mode. So I just want to go through it quickly. The idea is we try to analyze polystyrene particles and also PLA. The two types of particles at different temperatures, 600 degrees Celsius and 800 degrees Celsius. From this, you can see for both PS and PLA, the bulk and the single particle mass spectrums, they look very, very similar, and it's telling us that we are doing actually a pretty good job to get the average single particle mass spectrum that is comparable to the bulk mode. Next slide, please. Okay, so by doing this, we're trying to understand how how the vaporizer temperature that affects the nanoplastic detections, and we try to understand the RIE for different sizes of PS at different temperature. And the calibration approach here from bulk mode is that we have the nanoplastics that we generate from the laboratory. They're not all burnt plastic, it's a pure materials. When you use DMA for size selection and use the AMS for detection and compare the results to the CTC, that's a very standard way to calibrate the instruments. What's interesting to us is that you can see from this figure, the two temperatures basically show no effects on the RIE. The two lines almost overlap at all different sizes. But what's interesting to us is we observe strong size dependence for the RIE that we detect here. We are not quite sure again, but one hypothesis here you can imagine is the large particles may actually have like bigger inertia when they go into the instrument and hitting on a tungsten vaporizer that cause more bouncing. So and that's why we try to also do the RIE calibrations for the single particle approach, which is not sensitive to the collection efficiency and also the particle bouncing. Next animation, please. So here's the results. We compare the results from bulk and single particle mode at 800 degrees Celsius for both PS and PLA. And the orange bar showing in this figure is basically the RIE from the bulk mode. They are the data exactly on the left-hand side. And the blue bar, light bar, is showing the RIE determined by the single particle approach. And because the single particle approach is less sensitive for particle bouncing, when we take the ratio of the RIE obtained from these two approaches, we actually get a sense about the collection efficiency of particles in the instruments. And that's basically represented by the circle symbol in this figure. So what you can see here is that we determined the collection efficiency of the PS particles ranging from around 0.2 to 0.5. So which means actually large fractions of the PS particles are bouncing off from the tungsten vaporizer surface. And this is size dependence. And you can see the larger particles actually have the lower collection efficiency. And the similar observations also can find for the PLA particles. We atomized the 500 PLA particles and showing the collection efficiency about 0.2 as well. Next slide, please. So the previous slide showing that we actually have direct evidence of the particle bouncing, and this one is actually, we also have direct evidence for the delayed vaporizations. So for the left-hand side is showing the p-top size distributions from the AMS for bulk mode. We size select the around 340 nanometer PS and inject to the system at different temperature. So it's very similar to the PET burnt plastic particles that I present in the first part of this seminar. So the theoretical DVA showing up at the very early stage of the size distribution match quite well with what we expect. But what you're showing here, especially for 800 degrees Celsius, is have a long tail that's go up to about like 100 micron. That is actually not physically makes sense to us. So that is very keen indications that for PS, we have a very significant delay of vaporizations. But for that, we know, okay, we have the delay of vaporization process, but it's actually, we cannot like get the right size information. So what we can do with the single particle. So on the right-hand side, it's showing about the details of what's happening in terms of the vaporization time scale. So the blue trace here is showing for ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate, as I said, is the standard for AMS calibrations, and it shows very sharp vaporization process. And you can see basically most of the materials are vaporized within 0.2 millisecond. But when you look at the green trace, which is for the PS nanoplastics that we atomized, you can see it's showing like at the beginning it's have a sharp vaporization, but it's also have a very long tails, and the vaporization won't complete until 1 millisecond. For the PLA, it's slightly better, but you still need around 0.5 millisecond. So what we're showing here is that it seems that like for the delay of vaporization process, it doesn't really have much impact on the RRE determination that I showed in the last slide, but it have great impact in terms of the particle sizing detections. And it's very clear evidence from this time the ion vaporization profile from the single particle. It has we find delay of vaporization for PS and PLA particles. Next slide, please. So, but the good thing is, even though we know the single particle also detection method also suffer from the delay of vaporization, but the data structure that we obtain from this technique allow us to record the time that we first see the strong signal of the vaporizations. So which means that we can extract this information. Basically, it's the p-top timing to get the right particle sizing. So the graph on the left-hand side is showing the PS particles with 340 nanometer and 600 nanometer. You can see the theoretical value match quite well with our measurements. And that is telling us, yeah, we may not be able to detect a very accurate size information using a bulk mode, but a single particle can do the job for us. Next slide, please. And after that, we feel like, okay, it seems like we get some very useful information from single particle detection. So we try to generate some nanoplastic and inorganic mixture in the lab to see if we can use a single particle to better understand the mixing state of nanoplastic in the binary mixture system. So in this work, we just make with ammonium nitrate and the PS particles in the solution and different ratio and try to atomize it. And just like the cartoon showing here, we expect to see the particles with just nitrate and also just the PS, but also the mixture. And we want to see if we can quantify this mixing state. Next slide, please. Okay, so after we got a bunch of particle mass spectrum, I try to make the long story short. We run the clustering analysis of the single particle mass spectrum, and here's the results. And from the left-hand side is showing the map of the results, like showing for different PS to ammonium nitrate ratio. And the green data points is showing like the particles actually dominated by the PS materials. The blue one is showing the particles dominated by the ammonium nitrate. But for the pink and the orange rich color, is actually represent the particles mixed with PS and ammonium nitrate. I don't want to go through the details, but this clustering technique is very nice to illustrate that we have like materials from pure PS, pure ammonium nitrate, and also something mixed together. Just like, for example, on the right bottom corner, the 1:4 ratio of the PS and ammonium nitrate showing the bridge linking the two cluster quite well. And on the right-hand side, showing the particle number fraction for different types of particles. And you can see when we increasing the PS content in our atomizing solutions, which is on the left-hand side, we actually have more pure PS particles. On the right-hand side, we have more ammonium nitrate when we have very high fractions of ammonium nitrate in the bulk solutions. But what's interesting to us here is based on this method, we don't see much actual mixed particles in these experiments. It's only about 3 to 4% of the particles actually have silicon fractions of PS and nitrate in it. Next slide, please. Because each cluster actually like can represent by individual mass spectrum. So here, the left-hand side is showing the particle mass spectrum, average particle mass spectrums for mixed particle clusters, and you can see the mixed particles is the mixture of ammonium nitrate, which is showing the peaks at 30 and 46, and also a bunch of PS materials as well. And based on this information, we can also determine the composition of the mixed particles. And you can see when we have more PS in the bulk solution, we actually have the mixed particles having higher PS content in it. Next slide, please. But what is more interesting to us is that we also see the delay of vaporization process happen for the PS materials when they mix with nitrate. So for the top figures is showing on the left-hand side is the nitrate signal. You can see just like the pure ammonium nitrate, the nitrate materials in the mixed particles still vaporize pretty quick, within like 0.2 millisecond. But when you look at the fragments 91 from the PS, it's showing the delay of vaporizations. And we try to do the similar experiments with mix the PS with succinic acid because we want to see if we can do the same job to differentiate typical atmospheric organics and nanoparticle materials in our experiments. You can see the succinic acid fragments, which is 56 here, is also showing very fast vaporization process, with PS also showing the delay. And we are very excited about this because we know that when we're doing AMS measurements for organics, we actually deal with very low amounts of nanoplastic in the atmosphere. And we may not be able to really clearly to differentiate the nanoplastic fragments from the typical atmospheric organic materials. But this delay of vaporization profile can tell us that very unique parameters that we can identify to the nanoplastic in the more compressed mixture of atmospheric particles. Next slide, please. Okay, so this summary. So we actually have direct evidence from this study for showing the particle balancing because we determined the size dependent collection efficiency about 0.2 to 0.5 for PS, and it's also happened for the PLA. It's actually telling us we need to think about what to do the next, like how we can integrate this information to the lab or even field data analysis in the future. So again, we have direct evidence for the delay of vaporization process for pure nanoplastics. It has no impact for RIE determinations. It seems pretty good for that, but it results in poor bulk p-top sizing informations. But the single particle mode can do a pretty good job for the getting the good sizing informations. The last thing is also, I hope this is actually showing the large potentials of how we can use the single particle mode to investigate the nanoplastic mixing state, especially for the ion vaporization profile. Can become a very unique parameters to try to identify the presence of nanoplastic in the compressed mixture. And that's what we have for today. And I think Alfred and I are happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, there are a few questions in the chat window, and we also had some discussion that was happening in the chat. Jose says he'd like to follow up with you later with some of the questions. But if there's anything that you'd like to pick up from the chat window and maybe answer up.
I'd like to ask one of the questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So really nice work, Alex and Arthur. I think it's very compelling and very well done. I had one question. I mean, a lot of my questions have to do with AMS details that we can discuss offline, but have you tried looking at the semi-refractory signal, which is basically the slow changes that you can pick up on when you look at the time series of the closed? Because seeing the characteristics of these particles, that may be at least as powerful as as the single particle, and it could be done to all data sets.
Yeah. So I can answer these questions based on the pure nanoplastics, like especially for PS. We try to look at the closed mass spectrum, as you said, and we find out that's actually not much like the PS signal that we can find there. Is like compared to the open spectrum, it probably just like 1 to 2%. And that's actually telling us the delay of vaporization process is actually like very short. Even though it's delayed, but it's very short time scale. It doesn't really have much impact in terms of the mass spectrum mode quantifications, but it has impact on the p-top sizing time scale.
And that is true for all your different samples, or you haven't looked to all of them? It surprises me a little bit, by the way.
Mm-hmm. I also like very surprising for some of the results that you observed, because I saw some of the question in the chat when I did my the first part of my talk, we expect like when we change the vaporizer temperature to 800 degree or higher, we will have less delay of vaporizations, but it seems not solving the problem.
Sorry, last one. And you haven't tried the capture vaporizer, have you?
No, I don't have it.
Highly recommended.
But I'm not sure how it's going to solve the sizing problem. It seems to me like even though the delay vaporization happened, it's not. It seems to me it's not a big problem for the quantifications in mass spec mode, the bulk mode.
But it may retain the long time signal that may allow you to. Anyway, we can discuss.
I know what you mean, like bounce off and then, but they. Okay,
yeah.
Good point.
See,
I think
Sarah raised her hand.
Yeah, so I was really interested in the concentrations that you used. If you think that maybe the plastic, when it hits the vaporizer, it sort of like coats it with some, like it prevents subsequent particles from vaporizing.
So could you mind to ask question again?
If there's like a rapid, if they just keep they kind of melt but not really vaporize and kind of coat the vaporizer, is that something that could cause what you're seeing with the delayed vaporization?
Yeah, I think that is possible. But yeah, because when we try to look at the ion vaporization profile for different types of ions, let's say from PS, it's showing different time profile. It seems like it's multiple step vaporization mechanism happening. We maybe, yeah, that I don't know exactly what is happening, but it seems like it could be, as you said, like it's first. I should not. I don't want to say too much, but it's actually a multiple step process. Yeah, I don't want to like let you give the impressions that I know the details, but definitely it's a multiple step based on the mass recharge ion that we investigate for PS.
And it seems like it would affect, I mean, it would depend on the concentration too, like how rapidly you're kind of flooding the vaporizer with particles. Then you kind of build up like
I agree.
coating.
And that's why we try when for example, when we conduct the RI experiments, we try to keep it in less than 1,000 particles if possible. Yeah.
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah. That's a good idea. But if you coated it, then you will see a slow signal, which you don't see. So I would say that argues against it.
Hi, quick question. You had shown ammonium nitrate and the polystyrene latex, and showed that they didn't necessarily really mix well. Is that like just kind of a limitation of chemistry, or would we expect maybe something else to go on like in the actual environment?
Albert, do you want to answer this question?
Sure, I could try. I don't think we have the answer. I think Alex and I would agree. We don't really know. If we think about how, like the way that we generated these particle population was through atomizer, right? So we have a liquid solution, and if somehow that droplet that comes out of the atomizer contains a solid polystyrene particle with some ammonium nitrate solution, the ammonium nitrate, the water evaporates off, then you have a mixed particle. And then if somehow when we generate the droplet, this ammonium nitrate and the PS sort of separates from itself, then you would get the external mixture. This is just how we generated these particles. And I think that this will represent something like, for example, ocean water, right? Like with the sea surface water, when droplets comes off, you might have a mixture of a plastic and the salt solution. We don't really know if it condenses, right? So like typically in the atmospheric environment, the particle mixing happens probably through, especially for ammonium nitrate, which is semi-volatile, is evaporate and condensation. I don't think what we have done sort of represents that particular process. So I think that's where our experiments apply, and that's where it does not apply.
And also, I think it's maybe somewhat related to the crystallization process. We actually do the similar experiments with ammonium sulfate, and when we dry it, it's supposed to be crystallized. Nitrate may not. So, and we don't see even lower fractions of sulfates and PSL mixed particles as well. So we're not quite sure, but yeah, that is the study that we try to at least to see if the techniques can help us to detect the nanoplastic in the mixture.
I see that Lynn is here. Maybe she knows the answer and we don't. Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, hi, Arthur. Yeah, so based on the mixing, we think the ammonium nitrate can somehow coagulate with PS, and when they atomize together, they can emit it. And during the transportations in the atmosphere, they can, through some coagulations and condensations, they can mix together.